Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is The World Unpacked. In this episode, we're diving into the latest developments in the war in Ukraine, where the war stands now, how the Trump administration's decisions are shaping battlefield dynamics, and what's at stake for European security moving forward. We are recording this almost a week after the tense Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, a couple days after the Trump administration's subsequent decision to pause all military aid and key intelligence sharing to Ukraine. The US under President Trump also seems interested in thawing its relationship with Moscow, with the White House reportedly mulling Russian sanctions relief for seemingly little to nothing in return. All these developments raise serious questions over the US commitment to Ukraine's security. Meanwhile, European leaders are scrambling to respond and compensate for the US's role in the conflict. To help us unpack all this, I'm joined today by my colleague, the excellent Dara Massicot, Senior Fellow of the Carnegie Russia and Eurasia Program. Welcome back to the show, Dara.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with the situation on the ground. 3 years into this war, how would you describe the current state of the battlefield? Are we seeing any major shifts in momentum?
There's no major shifts right now. I was there in Ukraine visiting some of these units in October with our colleague Mike Kaufman. And since that time, there's been no real dramatic changes in the ground. So it's a lot of attrition along the front line. Ukrainian forces are being slowly pushed back in some areas where the Russians are putting particular emphasis, but they're also counterattacking too. So we see a line that is generally static, but we do see changing of hands here and there every now and then. The Kursk operation, where Ukraine is inside the Russian Federation, is they're gradually losing ground. They've lost around 50 to 60% of what they initially were occupying in the fall. So it's an attritional phase of the war. It's been like this for about a year and a half.
Okay. So what do you think will be the impact of Trump's pausing of military assistance and intelligence sharing on Ukraine's ability to continue the war effort as it has in recent months, both sort of in the short term and long term? What does this mean for the people fighting now? Do you have a sense of timelines for us?
I do. Yes, it is pretty serious, but let me try to add some nuance. The announcement that military aid would be suspended, and that was the first thing to consider. That probably allows the war to continue for maybe 2 or 3 months. That's the estimate that I have. That's the estimate I think the Ukrainians are putting out as well. Some of that capability can be backfilled by the Europeans. Some of it cannot. Like some of the more air defense systems like Patriot that help defend Kyiv and other places like that, they can't make up those type of capabilities. The more immediate problem, I think, is the announcement that U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine has been suspended. It's not clear to me if that is a full suspension, that would be devastating, or if it is a partial suspension of everything that they could use to strike on Russian territory itself. There's multiple rumors in the press, and it's a sensitive issue, so I've got to be careful about how I frame it. But that is on an immediate timeline. It essentially blinds the Ukrainians at operational and strategic depth to what the Russians are doing. So that would be very damaging to the war effort. The Europeans can, again, those countries who are capable of backfilling some types of intel sharing can do that. But that takes time to turn on if they don't have a contingency in place.
All right. Can you walk us through quickly what that means? It takes time to turn that on.
Yes. So if they, Ukraine has its own intelligence capability and its own bilateral relationship with other intel services, like in Europe and elsewhere. So if they have pre-existing channels, then information can flow quickly to try to compensate for the loss of U.S. intelligence. But to be candid, U.S. intelligence community is it is the most powerful one in the world.
Of course.
And without that capability, they are at a disadvantage. Tactically, the Ukrainians have made a lot of improvements to their own organic intelligence capabilities, which allows them to see what's going on the front line pretty well, and maybe a dozen kilometers or so behind that. But it's really that longer depth. Where is Russia regenerating? What are they doing inside Russia? Are they preparing to launch missiles or aircraft? Those kind of things Ukraine will lose the ability to know about. And of course, that results in degraded capability to intercept missiles. That means people will get injured and die.
Yeah. Europeans also rely massively on US intelligence sharing. Do you think there are going to be any second order restrictions on what Europeans are allowed to share with Ukraine?
Well, that was the rumor. If there's anything that is sourced from US intelligence, then that has been prohibited from being shared with the Ukrainians. So, potentially that is.
Yeah, so that would make backfilling very difficult.
It would, unless, there are, countries like the Five Eye partners that have pretty robust capabilities.
Yeah. So do you have a sense of what the cuts or the halting of US military aid means for equipment that was purchased by others, by Europeans, for instance, from the United States, that they might now want to use to backfill the US gaps? Will they be able to do that, or are there restrictions for them too?
Well, I think that countries that operate equipment like Patriot or other things are now looking at this and wondering, is this a capability that could be switched off for us if we needed it at some point, whether that's in Europe or whether that's Israel or any number of our global partners. They're all thinking these things right now. So whether or not they're able to make their own decisions to offset using some of this capability, I think that's probably a national level decision. But if the intel link is broken for missile warning or any other type of essential information, they can put it in Ukraine, but it won't be able to function to its full capacity. So it's a real challenge.
How is all of this affecting morale in Ukraine? What's your sense?
So I think there's a lot of shock right now. That's the primary reaction that we're hearing. And they know that this is serious. There are tensions between the two presidents, and it's very obvious that there are. But it is the soldiers who are in the trenches and in the bunkers and the civilians who pay the price, for withholding of aid and withholding of critical warning intelligence information. I think that, how does it impact morale and will to fight on the battlefield? Well, last year when the U.S. assistance was paused in Congress for months and months, it didn't really impact that on the ground. These soldiers still knew what their mission was. They were still very committed, very locked in. But it does contribute to some of the larger problems that we are seeing, like desertion or people going AWOL for a few weeks and then visiting their family, getting their mind right, and then returning back to the unit. That is a morale problem, and those kind of issues can accelerate because they're all wondering, how can we really keep this going if our biggest partner is no longer with us? So right now, like this, as in this week, we're not seeing anything, but that is something that I'm going to be watching very closely for. They're very tough. They've been through a lot, but at some point there is a breaking point.
Of course. How do you interpret President Trump's policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia? What would you say is his conception of the U.S. national interest here? What objectives is he pursuing?
Well, it seems to me that they've been very clear since the campaign that they want to bring the war to an end. Responsible end is what the language was during the campaign. And I think they've been pretty consistent about that they don't want to continue supplying the war at the level that it has been under the Biden administration. I think there is an additional component that there are longstanding tensions between President Zelensky and President Trump from the first administration. And I think that that's the backdrop for what we saw last Friday in the Oval Office. Whether or not that can be repaired between them, everything's changing every day, so it's hard to speculate on where this goes. I think the signing of this mineral deal is critical to maybe repairing some of that. But again, it's highly personal, I think, between the two of them. What does that mean for a responsible end of the war? I'm framing the activities that I've seen in the last week as compellence. Compel the Ukrainians to peace by suspending the aid, by cutting off intel, And the administration is very clear on this. We cannot resume this until there's what they say is a credible commitment to peace on behalf of the Ukrainians. I just haven't seen that same, energy towards Russia. What is Russia being asked to stop or give up? Because I'm seeing that the missiles continue to fly and the drones continue to fly against Ukraine. What are they doing? What are they being asked to do?
So, I want to just pause on the Russia angle for a second, because from the perspective of Ukrainians, from the perspective of Europeans, it matters whether we're looking at a US that wants to withdraw, retreat, have a smaller footprint in Europe, that wants to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, whatever that end, a responsible end, versus a US that prioritizes making a deal with Russia over Ukrainian security, that is willing to sacrifice parts of Ukrainian security to get to that deal. From what you've seen so far, what US are you seeing? What scenario is more likely?
Well, I do think that there's a strong energy around deal making.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the mineral agreement it's the first step of something, mm-hmm. right? This is, let's make a deal on this, and then we can talk about the specifics. At least that's my hope. Mm-hmm. Because you can't have a mineral deal in which you are investigating how much rare earths are available, which is still a question mark, without having protection for those sites. What businesses want to invest in Ukraine and operating in Ukraine if drones and missiles still fly? The insurance premiums and combat insurance riders, I know, are very expensive from personal experience. So these kind of guarantees have to be, if not part of this deal that's being discussed right now, they have to follow it. It has to be part and parcel of it. So you can walk into security guarantees in that way. Or an arrangement, as President Zelensky noted on social media, why don't we have a ceasefire in terms of everyone stops flying drones and missiles? I'll respect it if Russia respects it. These kind of things. That is an essential element of reconstruction in any terms. You can't reconstruct Ukraine if that risk is still present.
Yeah. Okay. So a minerals deal that gives the United States a stake and an interest in Ukrainian security as a first step to then a responsible peace deal.
That seems to be the theory
Mm-hmm.
that we're seeing here.
Yeah. And then to just halt on this responsible peace or end to the war, Europeans and Ukrainians would like a just and sustainable
Mm-hmm.
peace. Can you see the outlines of what that might look like already?
Well, so I think that I can give you what I don't think are workable outlines, and that's a lot of the provisions outlined in the Istanbul agreements. This is, for those that
Which
are not,
of course is what Russia
which is
would
what
like
Russia
to see and has been
Yes.
pushing in the Saudi Arabia talks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they want the Ukrainian military to be reduced in half from its pre-war setting, which was around 190,000. They want it down to 85,000 or less.
And right now it's at 500.
It's around 405.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's around there, which is a number that I don't think that they can financially sustain in peacetime. But to suggest that they somehow have to cut their military in half, well, of course, Russia's not making any type of reciprocal cuts or arrangements. It's not sound policy. It's not workable. In terms of other things, the Russians have demanded, in my perspective, that are not realistic. They have demanded that Ukraine give up all parts of 4 Ukrainian regions: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, even parts they don't occupy. And Russia does not have the military to deliver that to the Kremlin. So, I would think that forcing the Ukrainians into something like that when the Russian military is in no place to try to fight its way and take those lands for another year or two at best, I think would be unwise. Perhaps it's a negotiating point. The Russians are asking for more. They're willing to accept, less. Remains to be seen.
Yeah. Okay. We'll take a short break and then we'll talk about the critical decisions that Europe is facing now and whether it can sustain Ukraine in the absence of Washington.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. We have seen what I would characterize as significant momentum in Europe in recent days and weeks on all fronts, really, from national to European defense spending announcements, debates over how to compensate for US aid to Ukraine, and of course the efforts spearheaded by the UK and France to stand up a European peacekeeping or deterrence force, whatever you want to call it, to secure an eventual ceasefire in Ukraine. Maybe the first question to you is, what does Ukraine need most urgently from Europeans right now?
In terms of a peacekeeping force, I think probably what they need is a force to not necessarily be deployed along the front line, which is 750 kilometers plus, but to have a capability present to help them backstop, not necessarily fight, but to be there to deploy to different parts of the front as needed, potentially in different hubs inside Ukraine. In terms of functions that they need, that force could help them with a lot of staff work that they need to improve on at the brigade level and maybe above the brigade level. There's a lot of staff work and coordination that needs to be done. That certainly could be a benefit to them. I don't believe anything being discussed is, how do we bolster parts of the front line? How do we have troops in combat? But I think there has to be a halfway point, because what won't help the Ukrainians is if this is a symbolic or token force that is deployed in Lviv in the far west of Ukraine so that it can make a speedy exit when times get tough, like that would not, that's really not helping, and it's not really credible.
Not everyone will have an idea of what you mean when you say staff work. What does that look like concretely?
Yes. So the structure of the Ukrainian military is one that is based on brigades, and then a very large superstructure that sits on top of it that dozens of brigades report up to, and that's a lot to manage. So having militaries with experience in these large command formations like the United States with combatant commands and everything like that, that would be beneficial. The Ukrainians also need support in their training architecture and their training pipeline, not just combat skills, but how do you make officers? How do you make sergeants? How do you instill a different command and control style in your military to be efficient and lethal? Right now, there's still a lot of remnants in the Ukrainian military for how they produce leaders that are holdovers from this shared Soviet past, and they're trying to switch that out as quickly as possible, but it's hard to do when you're in a war of this type. So having that extra support there could be really helpful. Monitoring and reconnaissance would also be a critical component of any type of peace deal. That can be done with various types of monitoring missions. It can be supported by drones in a way that the previous agreements 10 years ago were not really able to be supported with, because the technology wasn't there and the Russians learned how to shoot down and jam everything. There's ways to get at this to reduce the human burden, and the use of technology and AI could probably help that force, whatever it ends up being. I would recommend anyway.
Okay. A couple more questions on this force. Maybe the I almost want to call it the politics of the European proposal. My sense would have always been that it is useful for Europeans to take the lead on this and make a proposal to the United States. They certainly seem to think that that's what the White House was asking them to do. And then we have, in recent days, heard some more dismissive comments on what the Europeans are doing. So do you think it is wanted by the United States, this European peacekeeping force, deterrent force. And I'm asking this because, we talk about backstops a lot, the Europeans backstopping the Ukrainians and then the Americans backstopping the Europeans. And backstop from the Americans can take lots of different forms. I think one that would probably, in my sense, need to be there is just U.S. support for this force with Russia, right? So that Russia would be forced to accept a European force like this. Do you think that that's there?
Well, so yeah, I don't know where their thinking is on this. If a credible proposal is presented, as in, here's our plan to resource this, here are the contributors, we're serious about it, we want to put X group of forces inside Ukraine. Then let's see what the administration's response to it is, because their objective has been and is still right now to get the Europeans to do more concrete steps. Right now, I think they're reacting to talk. Like the Europeans are thinking, we need to do this, we need to come up with a plan, and so they're reacting to that. Because I think they've seen the talk before, but let's see how they respond to an actual, plan. Here's what we want to do, and here's what we need you for, and whether that's presence in country or logistics support to get in country. I just think let's see what the reaction is to a concrete thing. Yeah. But they're signaling at this time, we don't want to have a role in it, like in country.
Right. And just to talk about that dynamic a little bit more, I think one reason, as you know, that Europeans are hesitant to put forward a concrete proposal is that they do feel like they would need some U.S. contribution. And another reason is that they sense that it might take away from NATO's forward posture, from NATO's regional plans. And so we are getting to a moment where we are seeing a distinction being made between Ukrainian security and NATO's security. And ironically, tragically, it's the frontline states who are having to make this distinction. So those countries that have been most engaged and most understanding of the Ukrainians' plight are now having to reconsider, or feeling that they have to reconsider contributing to a force like that because it would leave them vulnerable and exposed nationally. What, I guess, a comment on these developments and where you think the contributions in Europe can come from? What can they do without the Americans? Should it be mostly Western European countries that contribute in this case?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack. So, our colleague Mike Kaufman and Jack Watling, they just recently
War
wrote
on the Rocks.
Excellent piece in War on the Rocks about what would some potential requirements be for a European force. And the assessment that they came up with was a force of 30,000 in a few different places. My comment is if Europe, with the population that it has, cannot come up with 30,000 people against a threat that they claim is existential, then what are we doing? Mm-hmm. But I certainly understand how frontline states feel about this, because the Russian military is reconstituting, and that's right on their border. We are going to see these tensions worsen as years go by, and Russia is starting to crank out more and more armor and replenish some of what's been lost in the war. And that looks frightening on different timelines. If you are Estonia, if Russia reconstitutes a few divisions worth of equipment that's on your border, that is very concerning to you. That might not be so concerning to you if you sit in Germany or if you sit in France and sit in Portugal. So I think we're going to start to see these intra-alliance tensions come out. Every year it's going to get worse unless there's a strategy in place to deal with it. And it may be a situation where those who are truly on the edge are not able to contribute that force, and others step in to do it. It's a partnership. It's an alliance.
Mm-hmm. In terms of how the military operations, the command and control of such a force could be organized, it's not going to be a NATO force, but is there a future, is there a scenario where it relies on some of NATO's military structures? at least give NATO an idea of what is happening, because it does so directly impact on NATO's own deterrence posture?
Well, in terms of the technicals of command and control, I mean, yes. I mean, and this is where the Russians will try to stall this out in negotiation. They'll say, well, and they've already said this, we don't want any Europeans in Ukraine because you're all going to have to rely on NATO architecture to be able to communicate with one another. So you're not calling it a NATO force, but it is by default. And there's various schools of thought out there on should we listen to anything that they have to say about this or not. But that is what they will throw on the negotiation table, and so there really needs to be a response ready for that. There's intra-NATO communications is a long-standing problem, and it's not fully resolved. And so trying to transplant that into an environment like Ukraine is going to be very challenging, but I think there are mechanisms by some partners and allies to do this. But it'll take some thought.
Yeah. Okay. You've mentioned Russian military reconstitution, and I want to talk about that a bit more and ask you, I guess, so Russia, despite Western sanctions so far, has managed to sustain its war effort. So first question, what would Washington moving to ease sanctions on Moscow, what would be the implications of that for Russia's military and defense industrial reconstitution prospects? And even without an easing of sanctions, you've done a lot of work on where you see the Russian military and defense industrial base going in the next few years, and what that means for broader European security concerns.
Right. So I'll start with, if sanctions are not relieved, which is the status quo right now, and that was the assumption in writing the Carnegie report, Russia is able to offset a lot of the things that they need by going to China for extensive machine retooling. They're able to construct the missiles they need. They're getting the chips through various clandestine and covert means, shell companies, sanctions evasion. Methodology is very advanced at this point if you're Russia to get what you need. They're also making the decision that they would rather produce larger numbers of less sophisticated equipment. That's why they're going backwards in time to produce T-72 tanks that are modernized. They're not going with T-90s and armadas. They're not going with the next generation of things. They're just trying to go as rapidly and quickly as possible. The question that a lot of us have looking at the war is we know that they're cranking these things out now. Where are they? They're not coming to the front. So are they restocking their bases, or are there more problems that they're trying to hide within the factories themselves? This is something we're trying to track down at this point in time. What does it matter for this effort if sanctions are released or relieved in certain sectors? I don't really know what the administration has in mind when they came out of Riyadh talking about economic opportunities. Are we talking oil and gas? I mean, are we talking aluminum? The Kremlin right now is being very cunning and shrewd, as they are in these moments, and they're offering their own access to rare earths and offering to cut deals with people. I don't, that has an indirect impact on the war effort because more money is coming in, and it will, I guess, reduce inflation. And I'm not an economist here, but I think if it's truly like a true release of sanctions, then we could see production accelerate a bit more. We could see more foreign money coming in. They could expand their factories and everything else. So it's not positive. The Russian defense industrial base is heavily sanctioned right now. They are a global competitor to the United States, so I don't think it would be prudent. If we're just speaking in plain terms, It wouldn't be prudent business sense to release sanctions on one of our key arms industry competitors.
Yeah. I don't know if it is serious in this context to ask about timelines. And European politicians certainly feel the need to make claims about we might need to fight Russia at a NATO border 5 years from now, 7 years from now, 10 years from now. Do you think it's serious to make claims like that? Is it useful?
I mean, it's useful for planning functions. I've seen estimates from all over Europe that have been as short as 2 years to as long as 10. 2 years, I think, is probably giving the Russians a lot of credit that they don't perhaps deserve, given that we don't know how the military is going to look for Russia when this war ends. A lot of it will depend, again, inside Russia, on demobilization. What are they taking out of Ukraine, if anything? Are they still fighting in Ukraine? Are they still preparing to launch another invasion of Ukraine? If that's the case, the latter case, then no, I don't think there's anything left for NATO. We saw how much bandwidth was absorbed, at least with the army, for what they did in Ukraine. The Russian Air Force is still capable. It's still mostly fine. They've only lost maybe 10% or less of their airframes, and they're replacing them at this point. They've probably replaced a good percentage of what they've lost. But again, there's problems with Russian air power that aren't resolved. So my big bumper sticker here, I guess, if I was saying to NATO, thinking about what kind of Russia threat you'll be facing, I think we have learned a lot about their Air Force. We've learned a lot about their Navy, at least their surface Navy. They're not quite as capable as we thought for several structural reasons. But the Army picture, if they rebuild, which they will, and they will starve the rest of their federal budget to rebuild the Army, that's a pretty bad picture if you're sitting on the front lines of NATO. And the timelines for that depend on the mission. It could be, if it's a limited mission, it could be less than 5 years. Sure. If it's a large Ukraine-size operation, we're probably looking closer to a decade.
In terms of what Europeans are going to contribute, what they're willing to contribute, what they're willing to concretely do beyond just talking about European aid to Ukraine, we have heard European leaders, military, political leaders, talk about the war in Ukraine as an existential threat to Europe. My sense is that right now we are seeing a bit of the emperor has no clothes moment here, where the resources aren't actually matching that rhetoric. Do you share that assessment?
I do, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. There are 4 different groups that use the word existential. The Russians use it, the Ukrainians use it, the Europeans use it, and the Americans use it, or at least the previous administration did. Yeah. And everyone's saying it's an existential conflict, and it's not being resourced as if it's existential. Russia is not using everything in its toolkit to source a war. Because I know what that looks like. It looks like World War II. Ukraine is not using everything at its disposal. I mean, you walk around in the streets of Ukraine, even pretty close to the front, and people are just trying to go about their lives, but it is not like what you would think, a country at total existential war. There's men of all ages everywhere. In Europe, it's the same thing. Is it existential? Is Ukraine fighting on the edge of freedom? Does it all hinge on this? Then, why are we pursuing the policies and on the timescale that we're pursuing? And the same with the United States. Is it existential to the United States, or is it in an important security interest? And words matter, and the capabilities are not matching the words.
Yeah. Okay, that's really, really helpful. Thank you. And thank you for this whole conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. I do ask about books or papers at the end of the show that you would want to recommend. I really think we should recommend your Russian military reconstitution report. So that was end of last year for Carnegie, right?
Yes. Yeah. We have two reports that are a tandem. Mine is on military reconstitution to 2030, just looking at some of the structural factors that Russia will be coping with. And Mike Kaufman has one out on Russian military adaptation and evolution in context of the war, which is helpful for us to understand where they're moving as in the years ahead.
Dara, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Hyewon Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.